You already know the silence. You've sat with it. You've stared at your phone waiting for it to end. Replaying conversations, wondering what you said, what you missed, what shifted. And maybe you watched part one because some part of you needed a name for what you were feeling. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't give you just one answer. It gives you layers. And most people stop at the first one. So if you're someone who's been left in that quiet, or if you are the one who goes quiet, and you still don't fully understand why, this is part two, and it goes deeper. In part one, we talked about the surface reasons, the overwhelm, the shutdown, the way some men retreat into themselves, the way an animal retreats into a den, not to punish, but to survive. But there's a second layer underneath that, and it's one most people never reach, because it requires sitting in a kind of discomfort that most of us are trained to avoid from the time we're children. The second layer isn't about what he's feeling right now. It's about what he was never allowed to feel a long time ago. Carl Jung said that what we don't make conscious, we experience as fate. And I want you to hold that for a moment, because it explains so much of what happens in relationships, especially between men and the people who love them. The silence isn't random. It isn't cruelty most of the time. It's a pattern so old, so deeply carved into the architecture of who he is, that he doesn't even see it as a choice. It just happens. The way breathing happens, the way flinching happens. It's automatic. And automatic behavior always has a rule. Here's the question I want to plant early, and we'll come back to it. What does silence protect? Not just for him, for anyone who goes quiet under pressure. Because silence always protects something. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what that is, and why naming it changes everything. But first, we need to go back. Not to the relationship, back much further. Most men who go silent learned to go silent as boys, not because they were taught in any direct, deliberate way, but because the environment around them, family, school, culture, quietly, consistently rewarded one thing: containment. Don't cry, don't complain. Handle it. Walk it off. Be strong. These aren't malicious instructions. Most of the people who gave them were themselves carrying the same wound, passing it forward without knowing it. But what they created over years is a man who doesn't know how to let something out, because letting it out was. And so the silence becomes a skill, a survival skill. In childhood, it protected him from ridicule, from punishment, from the unbearable feeling of being too much or not enough. And survival skills don't disappear just because the danger does. They calcify. They become personality. They become just how I am. So when you're sitting across from him in a difficult moment, when you need him to speak, to open, to be present, you're not just asking him to talk. You're asking him to undo something that took 20, 30, maybe 40 years to build. And he might not even know that's what you're asking. This is where I want to be careful, Because there's a version of this conversation that becomes an excuse, that says he had a hard childhood, so the silence is just something you have to accept. And I don't believe that. I don't think you should either. Understanding the root of something isn't the same as surrendering to it. But you can't change what you can't see. And right now, most people, including the men themselves, can't see it. They're too close to it. It's the water they swim in. There's a second reason men go silent that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's this: the fear of becoming the villain. When conflict arises, when emotions escalate, when voices get louder, a man who has internalized the idea that his anger is dangerous, that his words will wound, that he is fundamentally too much, he doesn't fight. He disappears. Not because he doesn't care, because he cares so much about not causing damage that he removes himself from the equation entirely. The silence isn't indifference. It's a kind of desperate, misguided protection. Think about what that does to the person left behind. You're standing there, needing him, reaching for him, and he vanishes. Not physically sometimes, but emotionally, completely. And from the outside, it looks like he doesn't care. It looks like you don't matter. But from inside his experience, he's trying, in the only way he knows how, to keep something from breaking. He's just wrong about what needs protection. He's protecting the moment from escalation. And what actually needed protection was the connection. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that I keep returning to. He said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And I think about that in the context of emotions. The very thing that feels like a war, the shutdown, the withdrawal, the absence, is itself pointing toward what needs to be walked through. The silence is the map. It's showing you exactly where the wound is. The question is whether anyone's willing to look at it long to understand it.
Now, and this is important, I want to talk about what silence does to the person receiving it. Because we've been spending time inside his experience, and that's necessary. But the person waiting in the quiet has their own psychology at work, and it's just as layered. When someone you love goes silent, the mind doesn't sit still. It fills the void. It writes stories. And almost always, those stories are about you. I said something wrong. I'm too much. I'm not enough. He doesn't love me anymore. I'm losing him. The silence becomes a mirror, and what you see in it is your own deepest fear reflected back. This is where Krishnamurti's insight cuts through everything. He said that most of what we call relationship is actually just two people projecting their own psychological content onto each other. And in the silence, that projection accelerates. You're not just responding to his absence, you're responding to every previous absence. Every person who left without explanation. Every moment you were made to feel invisible. His silence lands on top of all of that, and suddenly it carries a weight he never intended and you never asked for. Both of you are trapped in different rooms of the same house. So what does silence protect? Here's the answer I promised you. Silence protects the self from exposure, from the terrifying vulnerability of being fully seen and found lacking. For him, speaking means risking. It means saying something wrong, something too much, something that confirms his deepest fear, that he is fundamentally unlovable, or dangerous or broken. And for the person waiting, the silence protects them from having to ask the harder question. What am I afraid to hear? Because sometimes the waiting is safer than the knowing. Honestly, this is the part that most conversations about silence skip entirely. They focus on the behavior, what he does, what you should do, how to get him to open up. And those things matter, but they're downstream of something more fundamental. The real question isn't, how do I get him to talk? The real question is, can I create a space where the truth feels survivable? Because he's not staying silent because he has nothing to say. He's staying silent because somewhere, deep in his nervous system, speaking feels like stepping off a ledge into open air. And here's where it gets genuinely difficult. Because creating that space, that kind of psychological safety, isn't something you can do on demand. It isn't a technique. It isn't a script. It requires something much harder. The willingness to stay regulated yourself when everything in you wants to pursue, to demand, to close the gap by force. The moment you escalate to fill his silence, the ledge gets higher, the door closes tighter. Not because he's punishing, but because his nervous system reads urgency as danger, and danger means retreat.
This doesn't mean you have to be endlessly patient. It doesn't mean your needs don't matter. They do, completely. But there's a difference between asking for what you need from a grounded place and pursuing him from a place of panic. One invites. The other confirms every fear he already has about connection being unsafe. And I know that's hard to hear. I know it feels deeply unfair that you have to manage your own fear in order to help him manage his. But that's the reality of two nervous systems trying to find each other across a history of old wounds. Alan Watts said something I've never been able to shake. He said, "The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance." And I think that applies here in a way that isn't immediately obvious. The silence is a kind of change. It's uncomfortable, it's disorienting, and the instinct is to stop it, to force a return to the familiar. But what if the silence is asking something of both of you? What if it's not the problem, but the threshold? The place you have to pass through together, or not at all. There's one more layer I want to name before we close this part, and it's the one that's most uncomfortable to say out loud. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the silence is a choice. Not a conscious, calculated cruelty, but a choice born from the belief that nothing he says will matter anyway. That the conversation is already decided, that you've already made up your mind about who he is, and speaking is just going through the motions. And when a man believes that, the silence isn't withdrawal, it's surrender. It's the quiet of someone who has stopped believing the door will open. That's the hardest truth in all of this, because it means the silence isn't just his to fix. It's a shared wound, and shared wounds require shared willingness. Not equal effort. Sometimes one person has to hold more for a while, but shared direction. Both of you moving, however slowly, toward the thing that scares you most. Being fully known and choosing to stay. That's not a romantic idea. It's the most difficult psychological work two people can do together. And most people never attempt it. They just drift further apart. So, here's what I want you to take from part 2. The silence has a history. It has a logic. It's protecting something in him and possibly in you as well. Understanding that doesn't excuse it, but it changes the question you're asking. Instead of, why won't he talk to me? The question becomes, what would make it safe enough to try? And that question, that single shift in framing, is where something real can begin to move. In part 3, we go further. We talk about what actually breaks the pattern. Not techniques, not scripts, the deeper thing. The thing most people are too afraid to do.